So let's talk a little bit about the CO2, as obviously it's a result of breathing.
Yeah.
We need it to feed plants. Let's go through those topics a little bit. What are the benefits of CO2?
Right.
How do plants respond to increased CO2?
Right.
And cover that topic.
Right. Well, plants are the basis for most life on Earth. You know, they convert sunlight, the energy of sunlight, into chemical energy in the form of sugar to begin with. The details of this were first worked out by Calvin at Berkeley. It was over 50 years ago now, but it was the right time to do it because they had radioactive labeling then for the first time, so you could label things with carbon-14 and or isotopes of oxygen and tell what was being converted into what. So I think everyone knows that when photosynthesis takes place, that plants evolve oxygen. They convert CO2 into sugar. And one of the first things that Calvin and his team showed was that the oxygen that bubbles off, say, algae that is being illuminated by light, it doesn't come from the CO2 where you might think. It actually comes from the water. You could demonstrate that very easily by isotopic labeling. So the plant really has to have CO2 to live, most plants. There are other ways, you know, these ocean vent communities can synthesize, the molecules of life in the dark, deep under the ocean without light. But that's a very small fraction of the life on Earth. It's a niche way to make a living. But there they use the chemical energy from, various chemicals that bubble up from the vent and from the oxygen in the water, and by combining these in the right way and using CO2, they still have to have CO2. They can make sugar and the other molecules of life even without light, but that's unusual. So it's known quite well that plants do better with more CO2. You would naturally assume that because after all, that's what they're using to make sugar. I maybe take a slight digression to talk about the history of CO2. It was discovered actually very early in the 1750s by Joseph Black, who was a physician and an amateur scientist in Edinburgh. It's where my father got his medical degree. And so he had noticed that if you take things like magnesium carbonate or calcium carbonate and you heat them, as you do, for example, to make lime, to make burnt lime for cement, that if you look at the burnt lime, it doesn't weigh as much as the limestone that you put there to begin with, by quite a lot. So he realized that something was being lost when you heated these up, but there was nothing obvious, and it was a gas, and so he called it fixed air. So for at least 50 years, carbon dioxide was called fixed air, in the sense that if you left this burnt lime in the air for a few weeks, then the CO2 from the air would come back and gradually recombine with it, and you would eventually get calcium carbonate again, as opposed to calcium oxide or calcium hydroxide. One of the first experiments that Black did back in the 1750s was to collect this fixed air from heating limestone in a bell jar, and he put a candle in a bell jar with the CO2, and you notice it immediately went out, so it's clear that fire will not burn in CO2, and we still use CO2 in fire extinguishers today. If you have a little red fire extinguisher in your kitchen, it usually has CO2 in it. And he also noticed that if you put a mouse in it, the poor mouse expires. The mouse can't live in pure CO2, it has to have oxygen. So too much CO2 definitely is dangerous, so it's not like a pollutant. It's not like, chlorine gas or phosgene gas, which only tiny amounts, do you a great deal of harm. Small amounts of CO2 are actually good for you. If you don't have enough CO2, you hyperventilate, and there are other bad things that can happen. Anyway, Black discovered that pure CO2 is not good for you. This happens naturally, for example, in breweries. If you go to a brewery where they are fermenting, the mash for beer, you occasionally find dead mice around the vat where they had hoped to get a little tipsy on the brew, but they got overwhelmed by the CO2 and died. So it's a sad way, but it was probably a pleasant way to end their life. Paracelsus, the great medieval physician and philosopher, that the dose makes the poison, that the amounts of CO2 that we have today in the air are actually quite low by geological standards. They're low by the amount in our lungs. In our lung, typically you have 40,000 parts per million CO2. The air is around 400, so it's 100 times less in the air than in your lung. So it really doesn't matter whether it's 400 parts per million in the air or 280, whatever it was 200 years ago, or whether it's 800 if you double it. It's not going to make any difference because there's so much already in your own lungs and in your body that it doesn't matter. And so we've done lots and lots of experiments with people inhaling air with more CO2 than normal, especially for our submarine crews, where you have to stay underwater for 3 months at a time, on the boomers especially, the ballistic missile submarines. And so every human, every one of the crew is breathing out roughly 2 pounds of CO2 a day. People don't realize how much CO2 humans make. And 2 pounds a day and hundreds of crew, that's hundreds and hundreds of pounds every day. They don't try and keep the CO2 level in a submarine down at 280 or 400 or even at 1,000. The limit is several thousand. So, you don't notice any effect in naval studies below 5,000 parts per million, more than 10 times what's in the air now. It just has no effect on people, as you would expect, again, because there's so much in your own lungs, that trivial amount compared to what's in your lung. So the amounts of CO2 that we can make by burning fossil fuel are not enough to matter at all to us. But it matters a lot to plants because plants need CO2 to make sugar from the sun. Sunlight and water and CO2, they make sugar. And secondly, because, and this is actually much more important for land plants, is because CO2 allows them to use less water. If you think about a plant, it has a real engineering dilemma. It's got to get CO2 to do photosynthesis, and it has to get it from the air, so there have to be little holes in the leaf of the plant, the stomata, it's a Greek word, it means the little mouth. And the little mouth is where CO2 diffuses in. It's not pumped in, it has to diffuse in. And so the leaf is supposed to be full of water, plants need water. And so for every CO2 molecule that diffuses in, typically 100 water molecules will diffuse out. So in order to get the CO2 to eat, the plant is losing water like crazy. It's transpiring water all over the place. And in many ways that's good. It cools down the environment, from the heat of evaporation, but it's bad in the sense that the plant can use up all the water and then, it dies of the drought. So plant has been around for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. And so over this long period of time, plants have adapted to changing levels of CO2. CO2 is never constant, geologically speaking. At some periods in geological history, it's been much higher than now. Very few times has it been lower, only once or twice. And so plants have had to adapt to high levels of CO2 and low levels of CO2. They'd much rather have high levels. And when there are high levels of CO2, which is the geological norm, plants grow leaves with fewer stomata in them. And even with the leaf they have, they don't open the stomata as much. The little holes are not as wide open because there's more CO2 and they don't have to open their mouths so wide. There's more to get. And that means they lose less water. So roughly speaking, if you double the amount of CO2 in the air, you have the amount of water that the plant loses through its leaf. It's a simple calculation. They're both diffusion limited. You know about that from semiconductors. It's a diffusion process. So you can already see this effect from satellite photographs of the Earth, that if you look at the Earth today with satellite images compared to the Earth 40 years ago when we first started satellite observations, the Earth is obviously greener now than it was even 40 years ago. And where you see this most strikingly is in the arid regions of the Earth, the edges of deserts, Western Australia, the Sahel, Western U.S., Nevada, where we are today. These places are greener than they used to be. And that's because it's not that there's a lot more rainfall. There actually is about the same amount of rain as there was 40 years ago, but there's more CO2. So the plants are able to live in regions that used to be too dry for them to live. They simply don't need as much water as they used to need. So that's by far the biggest benefit of CO2 to life on Earth, is it allows vegetation to spread to areas that used to be too dry to let plants grow. So it's a land plant issue. It doesn't matter for algae in the sea, but it does matter a lot for land plants. But then with more CO2, the plant actually does grow better, and greenhouse operators have known that for, many decades, and so many greenhouse operators pay to produce CO2 to increase the levels inside the greenhouse. The cheapest way to do it is usually to burn propane. So you don't actually buy a tank of CO2, you buy a tank of propane and you burn it and you exhaust the water vapor and CO2 into the greenhouse. You have to strip out the heat first, so it seems sort of crazy. Most of the time you burn propane to get the heat. Here you throw the heat away and you put the exhaust into the greenhouse. But in spite of having to pay for the propane, this is a good investment for the greenhouse operator, because the plants grow so much better. You get better quality fruits, you get better quality flowers, you get a better price when you sell them. So it's okay. And and then there's a third, I think scientifically very interesting aspect to this, which is also important practically, and that is that CO2 is converted into sugar. It can be converted into sugar in the dark. It doesn't need sunlight, provided there's chemical energy. So for example, that's why you can make sugar at a deep sea vent where there is no sunlight at all. What you need is the chemical energy of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the small change of energy in biological processes. And so this again was discovered by Calvin and his team at Berkeley. So fixing CO2 into sugar is a reaction that proceeds in the dark. What you need the light for is to make the ATP originally, the chemical fuel that's needed. So the way it happens is the CO2 molecule is captured by a big complicated enzyme that was invented a long time ago. And this enzyme takes a CO2 molecule and water molecules, and it uses the chemical energy of the surrounding ATP. It typically needs 8 or so ATP molecules to make a bond between the CO2 and a new sugar molecule. And so this happens in the dark. And so the molecule is called Rubisco, and it must have been invented something like 3.5 billion years ago. It's a very, very old molecule, because that's when there's the first evidence of photosynthesis by blue-green algae in the oceans. And when this was invented 3.5 billion years ago, there was not much oxygen in the atmosphere, because the oxygen has come from photosynthesis over billions of years of life on Earth, and there wasn't oxygen in the original Earth. You can tell that from the fact that it's quite clear the early oceans were full of ferrous iron. Was probably the deep green sea, not the deep blue sea at that time, because of all the dissolved ferrous iron. And then as plants started evolving oxygen, algae and stuff like that, there eventually became so much oxygen in the oceans and in the atmosphere that it started to oxidize the ferrous iron, this green iron, much like you form bog iron today. If you've ever been to a region where bog iron is being made, you get water saturated in ferrous iron coming up from the bog, and then it gets oxidized at the surface. You get this red scum that sinks down and makes high-grade iron ore, where it's iron oxide. So this happened on a grand scale, maybe 2.5 billion years ago, 2 billion years ago, when essentially all of the ferrous iron precipitated out of the oceans to make some of the big iron deposits. The Mesabi Iron Range, for example, is ocean bottom iron that was formed at this time of the great oxidation event when the air flipped from being anoxic to oxic. Anyway, I've been digressing a little bit, so let me get back to why this is interesting. The reason it's interesting is Rubisco, this key enzyme that does the assembly of CO2 into sugar, was made when nature didn't have to worry about oxygen. And so it turns out that it's poisoned by oxygen. It did not matter 3.5 billion years ago because there wasn't any oxygen around to worry about. And the amount that it made from photosynthesis rapidly diffused away, so it was a waste product that was no problem. But as there began to be more and more oxygen in the air, this did become a problem. It's a problem today. So if you look at a typical wheat plant or a rice plant or a cotton plant, soybean, it loses about 25% of its potential efficiency at the current low levels of CO2 because of Rubisco being poisoned by oxygen. It's called photorespiration. And so what happens as the plant starts to make lots and lots of sugar, it uses up all the CO2. It's a diffusion limited process, so you quickly use it up. And so the plant is all out of CO2, but it's still loaded with ATP, chemical energy. It's got this enzyme eager to do something. What am I supposed to do? Sit around here on welfare? I need something to work on. And so it grabs an oxygen molecule and it turns it into nasty things like hydrogen peroxide, highly oxidizing, very damaging chemicals. And it's just the way that Rubisco was designed. It was a mistake at the time. It's too late to go back and fix it. It was a mistake that was made 3.5 billion years ago. So plants have been struggling with this for forever. Another thing that increasing CO2 helps to fix is this photorespiration problem, this sort of 25% loss in efficiency that most of our crop plants have. All of the trees have this problem. You probably know there are several major photosynthetic paths that plants use. The most important one was the one discovered by Calvin and his team. It's called C3. And the reason it's called C3 is that the first sugar to which you attach a CO2 molecule, having combined it with water, has 3 carbons in it. So the C3 is the 3 carbons in this very simple sugar molecule. Eventually, it builds it up to 6, to glucose. But the first step is only 3. And so that's the C3 mechanism. It's by far the most efficient photosynthetic mechanism. And so most plants use it if they can, but because it's so efficient. And that's, as I said, all trees, most of our major crops, rice, wheat, soybeans. But there are several exceptions, and I'll mention 2 of them. One is American corn, maize to Europeans, and sugarcane. There are a few others, but they're important plants, and they have a slightly different way of photosynthesis called C4. And so what these plants do, the C4 plants, corn or sugarcane, is they take this enzyme, Rubisco, and they build a fiber bundle to protect it from oxygen. So the Rubisco molecule is in little fiber bundles, and oxygen can't reach it, but light can. The fiber is transparent. But also CO2 can't get there either, and so in return for protecting the Rubisco from oxygen, the corn and the sugarcane have to have additional biochemical machinery to ferry CO2 into the fiber bundle where it can be used by the Rubisco and the sunlight and the water to make sugar. So you pay a price, but you get rid of this poisoning of the Rubisco by oxygen by protecting it in the fiber bundle. These plants, corn, sugarcane, do not benefit as much from more CO2. They do benefit, but not as much as C3 plants, because for the C3 plant, in addition to the benefit from more efficient water use that I mentioned, which is also true for sugarcane or corn, you also benefit from the suppression of photorespiration, this sort of 25% loss in efficiency that the plants are stuck with today. So there's nothing about more CO2 that, at least for the plant world, is not a good thing. I'm sure plants are saying, thank you, humanity, for enriching our world with more CO2.